For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. He is the master of mankind. By the might of his inexhaustible armies, 1,000,000 worlds stand against the dark. Yet, he is a rotting carcass, the carrion lord of the Imperium, held in life by marvels from the dark age of technology and the 1,000 souls sacrificed each day so that his may continue to burn. To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. It is to suffer an eternity of carnage and slaughter. It is to have cries of anguish and sorrow drowned by the thirsting laughter of dark gods. This is a dark and terrible era where you will find little comfort or hope. Forget the power of technology and science. Forget the promise of progress and advancement. Forget any notion of common humanity or compassion. There is no peace amongst the stars. For in the grim darkness of the future, there is only war. Hey friends, it's me, the Ebony Otaku, the well-rounded nerd. It is so good to be getting back to making videos. I have missed this. I have missed especially sharing Warhammer with the people. We're going to be getting back into old Mr. Fabius Bile today and all of his escapades across the galaxy. As you can see, I am wearing my hair natural for the time being. I have discovered a hair wax, so I will never, ever, 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 ever bleach my hair. I've got a really good afro going on, but I've also got very soft, fine hair. And if I understand from my Brad Mondo and Hair Buddha videos, soft, fine hair actually bleaches the best, but every home bleach reaction that they do and someone has just burnt off all their hair, like I feel like that would be me. But the hair wax is really cool because when you have, black hair, dark brown or black hair, it is super difficult to get it to color because basically to do anything with it, you have to strip all the natural pigment out to put pigment back in. But hair wax is really cool because it actually will lay on top of dark hair. And I've gone kind of like a fall thing. So I've got like an aquamarine green bang going and the rest of it's like super orange. So like I kind of turned myself into a pumpkin, but fall is upon us. So it seemed appropriate. So I'm going to have a lot of fun playing with my hair over the next few weeks. So expect to see it change a lot because why not? So let's catch back up to who we're talking about today. This guy, the Bile. Fabius Bile. Again, can't imagine how somebody with a name like Fabius Bile would turn out to be a villain. Can't see how that happened. Like, look, someone pointed out in the comments to me a few videos ago, they're like, well, he wasn't evil until all of this, blah, 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 so his name means nothing. Settle down. But also, literally a communications professional, originally a theater and English major, just got a Bachelor of Science degree in communication. There are no accidents in storytelling. The originator of the character Fabius Bile gave him that name because he was always intended to turn out to be something gruesome. That's how writing works. There are no accidents in writing. I mean, sometimes accidental genius does happen where people look backwards into their writing and read a bunch of things in that were never there to begin with. I'm looking at you, J.K. Rowling. But on the whole, writing is very intentional. He was always going to be evil. But that's what's really cool about this character and the Warhammer universe. We've got a lot going on in the Warhammer world as far as the tabletop game now. They got the 30K stuff out, which I actually found a 30K dual army starter kit that I'm probably going to pick up in a few weeks because I want it. If you've been following just me posting pictures and stuff as I finish out my leave of absence and whatnot, you'll see that I'm in the process of painting and building an army of Chaos Word Bearers. My next army, it's kill team, so it's only 10 figures, not super difficult. But my next army I'm going to build will be Ultramarines. I've actually got a set of Imperial fighters that I'm going to turn into Ultramarines. But the box I get, one army is going to be Ultramarines. I have not decided what the other one's going to be. I'm feeling Salamanders, but that means I still might need another Chaos Army to create. I don't know. But there's just a lot going on. I'm thinking Ultramarines and Salamanders are the way that I want to go, because as far as the Loyal Legions, those are my favorites. By far, Vulcan lives. Look at me, look at me. Vulcan lives. But I digress. Back to the thought I was having. So, you know, there's a lot going on in the Warhammer universe right now. We got the 40K stuff out, the pre-Horus Heresy stuff, the Horus Heresy, the 30K, the Emperor maybe coming back and all that going on. There is so much lore that is going on right now. But I like to focus on chunks of lore at the time, especially the lore that got me to really enjoy. And Fabius Bile was one of those characters, as I read through the Fulgrim saga across the different books where he appears, that really interested me, because Fabius Bile is quite the character. Because remember, even though, you know, Fabius Bile, what an evil name, blah, 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 blah. In the world of Warhammer, good and evil are entirely in the eye of the beholder. They are in the sword in hand of the wielder. It is completely a matter of perception and goal that decides if something is good or evil, and these things are never so simple in Warhammer. So taking us back just a little bit, we have to remember from where this character comes. Fabius Bile was a chief apothecary of the Emperor's Children, which, as you recall, Fulgrim's Legion. The Emperor's Children, the reason they called themselves that is they prided themselves on being perfectionist in whatever it was they chose to pursue. If one determined to be a perfect swordsman, Lucius, then one practiced that art, and even unto the pain of death, to be as good at the art as one could be, beyond even what they thought their Primarch to be capable of, although we all know no Space Marine, regular Space Marine is going to be able to match a Primarch, but that was the aspiration, to reach that level of perfection. In the case of all of the Remembrancers that were aboard the Emperor's Children, it was their job to capture all the feats that were going on during the Great Crusade that the Emperor's Children were partaking in. If one was a sculptor, you better sculpt the sculpt out of that sculpt as it sculpts. If you were a painter, you better paint the paint out of that paint ever it paints. If you are a musician, and so forth. Perfection is the name of the game with the Emperor's Children, because bearing that name meant that their gene seed should produce the best of what the Emperor has to offer. But where did that come from? So if you know the lore of the Emperor's Children, they were cursed by a gene blight at their inception. When Horus and other legions had joined with the Emperor, been rediscovered, their Primarchs were calling the Emperor father, yada, yada, yada. The Emperor's Children were left behind on Terra and their homeworld initially because of the gene blight. So the way a Space Marine is created is a gene seed, a piece of the Primarch, who is the father of a legion, is placed inside of a legionary supplicant, a young man, a boy, who would become a legionary. If that gene material of the Primarch would take to that body, then it would begin to transform them into basically, you know, a demigod. You know, the extra hearts, the extra lungs, all that good stuff. Make them taller, stronger, just brutes of humanity. Well, in the Emperor's Children, the process wasn't working correctly at their inception. They might get boys and men to be Space Marines, but then there would be a corruption in their genetic makeup that would keep them from being everything they could be, and would even produce mutations up until the point of death. So when that blight was actually finally controlled, and the Emperor's children were allowed to be a part of the fighting, they really took it upon themselves to kind of overcorrect, because they were the legion that was left behind for a while, and they were the legion that everyone else felt sorry for, to make themselves better than everyone. They had all of this time that they missed in the Great Crusade because they were too busy being sick, for lack of, phrasing, and then they're finally allowed to rejoin their brothers on the battlefield, and they want to be the best of the best of the best. They want to prove that they really have earned the name of Emperor's children. And Fulgrim demands that no matter what they pursue, be it a machinist, be it being an apothecary, to be a swordsman, a gut, whatever it is, be perfect. Let's show the rest of the legions that we truly are the Emperor's children. Something that's really interesting is that Fabius Bile was the chief apothecary instrumental in finding the cure to this blight. However, it was never actually really cured. It was suppressed, and suppressed enough that they could produce Space Marines. And I would theorize that the reason Fulgrim's legion fell so quickly to chaos was because they already had some form of corruption in them, in the corrupted gene seed. Fulgrim himself, that's where who they become is coming from. And if the material implanted in them is already corrupted, if the spirit's already corrupt, I mean, the imagery, the symbolism, blah, 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 then the legionaries really didn't have a chance to be what they were meant to be. And later years in Warhammer lore, there are Emperor's children who succumb to the blight that they thought had been overcome. And even Fabius Bile, throughout different interactions we have with him in the different books, is straight up like, oh, it's not cured. It's still there. It's not affecting you. But rest assured, it's still there. When it decides to rear its ugly head, it gonna be bad. So, to the chief apothecary, what would be perfection? What would someone like Fabius Bile pursue for perfection? And to Fabius Bile, his journey is the human body is imperfect. It's imperfect because it dies. He doesn't want to die. That's as basic as it gets. He does experiment after experiment after experiment to find a way to produce flesh that will not perish, that can suffer every injury, every ailment, every malady. I'm running out of synonyms. That can suffer anything. And in his pursuit, he has no regard for life. None. Because there's only one life that matters to him, and that's his own. Ultimately, in his apothecarium on the Emperor's Children's flagship, he is doing experiments long before Fulgrim falls to chaos, because he had already fallen long before. He's friends with Eidolon and Erebus. We remember them from other books. We'll get into that in another video. But, there was already seeds of corruption before chaos fully bloomed in any legion that it bloomed in. And Fabius Bile, when we go into his apothecary, especially in Fulgrim's title novel, Fulgrim, and you see what he's been doing in there, he didn't just start yesterday. If they capture any life form on a planet that's been brought to conquer, or legionaries who are thought to be dead and their gene seed collected from the battlefield might still have life and meat in them, they end up in his apothecarium. And untold horrors befall them when the full weight of the Horus Heresy is brought out for the entire galaxy to know, and all the legions know what side is what. All of them have a common fear, whether they be loyalists, chaos, or independent. No one wants to end up in Apothecary Fabius Bile's laboratory, because he's not merely experimenting with the flesh. He becomes a being who is so detached from any concept of humanity that there is nothing that is off limits to him. Any form of flesh and bone that appears in his clutches is going to suffer. Maybe for an experiment, maybe there is a goal in mind, maybe it is for the sake of amusement, but you will suffer if you're captured by Bile. And later on, when Bile goes off on his own and has a Eldar craft world that he turns into his base of operations, unless you're one of Bile's favorites, you don't want to be caught on that world, because he doesn't stop. Before the Horus Heresy, during the Horus Heresy, during 30K, 40K, and for as long as he lives, he has a singular goal: to keep experimenting until he achieves his end, which is he wants to live forever. So in Fabius Bile, the book, and I've got the omnibus here because I love an omnibus. One of his previous disciples, Oleander, who had left the craft world and was, at least according to Bile and all of the other servants of Bile, his most devoted, his prodigy, just basically a miniature Bile, leaves because he wanted to pursue other things. And everybody thought he'd never come back because they were pretty sure Bile would take him out the second he set foot on the planet. But Oleander comes back. And when we left off with Bile and Oleander having a conversation, Bile does allow him to live and come to talk to him. Oleander presents an offer basically that Bile can't refuse. He has discovered a crone world that is dead or dying, and it is ripe for the picking, not just for technology and things that are stagnant. There's life on that world that could be picked. And Fabius Bile is always looking for new raw materials for his experiments. And there is very little that gets him off of his own world at this point in the Warhammer legacy. He is caught up in his own self, even when Oleander walks in on Bile, as we read in the last our last gathering around Warhammer. Bile is operating on himself. You know, he's got the arms sticking out of his back that, you know, and he can operate on himself. And Oleander walks in, and Bile is picking through his organs and sewing stuff up because he's decaying. And Bile has also created different clone bodies so that one body fails, you can transfer his consciousness into another body. But there's also versions of Bile out there in the universe just running around, doing whatever they want to do, being Bile. So there's also just this air of, is this actually Bile at this point? Which I believe Oleander would know the real Bile from the fake ones. But, you know, that's the fun of reading and discovery, to see how much someone uncovers and how much they know, and how that knowledge affects them throughout their journey. But Bile is not playing. Even when he talks to Oleander, he, you know, and he's operating on himself, he's like, I've only got like another 1,000 years in this body. And for a being that could be functionally immortal, if not for that blight, that's got to stick. Oh, that's got to be tough. Because the Space Marines, if not for war, you know, if not for the potential for getting taken out by a battle, they're like the Primarchs. They could conceivably live forever. And Bile feels like that's been stolen from him. To him, only having 500 or 1,000 years left is to a regular human thinking, I've only got 5 or 10 years left. Because he feels he should have more. There should be more time for him in the universe. He has so much more to accomplish. And he's so dedicated that he doesn't leave his world, unless he absolutely has to. But an Eldar craft world, you say? This is a pursuit worth investigating. Let's actually go talk about it with the kindred that you left behind. And that's where we pick up our story. Fabius Bile, The Omnibus, by Josh Reynolds. Chapter 4, Brotherhood of Monsters. Bile swept through the corridors of the palace, followed by Oleander and the Gland Hounds. Oleander kept one eye on Igori and her packmates. If Bile gave the order, they would leap on him without hesitation. He didn't doubt he would survive the fight that followed, but it would take more time than he had to kill them. Igori met his glances with a stony expression. He wondered if she were thinking the same thing. "Are you listening, Oleander?" Oleander's attentions snapped back to his former master. "Yes," he said, automatically. Bile turned and stopped. A crooked smile contorted his features. "No, you weren't. That has always been your problem. You never listened. Do not think that because I have spared you thus far, I will tolerate your flaws as I once did. Listen, or I will strip you to the bedrock and mine your bones for useful material." "I am listening, Master. Your every word resonates upon my consciousness like the voice of Fulgrim himself," Oleander said. He bowed with a florid grace, eliciting a chuckle from Bile. Amusing the chief apothecary was no easy task, but it was well worth it. It had kept him alive and whole where better men had wound up on Bile's operating table, dissected and scattered. "Good," Bile said. He extended his scepter and lifted Oleander's chin. "I have considered your offer and come to a decision. You will present your proposition to the consortium as a whole. If some among them find merit in your proposal, then I shall take such action as I deem best. And if they do not, if none among the consortium are interested in your proposal, I shall break you down into raw components and forget your name," Bile said. "You were exiled for a reason, Oleander. It is only just, then, that punishment be meted out accordingly." Oleander stepped back, rubbing his chin. Bile followed him, leading close. "Without rules, we are barbarians. Don't you agree?" "There is something to be said for barbarism." "Yes, much of it unintelligible. He who dares wins. You've risked much coming back. It seems only fitting to push your luck a little further, eh?" Bile looked at him. There was an unnatural gleam in the chief apothecary's eye. Oleander frowned. A bit of theater, then, to see him squirm. No more than that. A test. As Arian had reminded him, Bile loved his test. His little games were legendary. Few among the consortium had not suffered in some way from the chief apothecary's twisted attentions. But that didn't make it any more bearable when you were on the other end of the scalpel. Bile couldn't help but probe and test the minds and wills of those who followed him. It was as if he were looking for something in particular, though he never said what. Well, if it were a test, Oleander intended to pass. He grinned. Why not? Let us see how far this particular ligament can stretch before it snaps, shall we? The auditorium is a cavernous chamber, carved out of the heart of the palace. It had been an arena once, and blood had been spilled on its floors. Massive pillars held up the cracked shell of the roof. Semicircular benches ascended from the floor to the uppermost reaches around the center of the chamber. Sickly vegetation clung to the buckled flagstones and cracked walls winding amongst the benches. The walls had once been covered in carvings, both obscene and grisly, but were now chiseled bare to make way for diagnostic screens and hololith overlays, allowing those in the middle of sensitive experiments to participate without having to leave their laboratories. A great dais had been installed in the center of the chamber. Heavy examination platforms lay crouched around the dais, their surfaces covered in old stains. It was from here that Bile often delivered his most pointed lessons, but it was also a gathering place for the consortium as a whole. When matters of import reared their head, it was a war room, cloaked in collegiate terms. In those matters that concerned them all, Bile was determined to appear as nothing less than egalitarian. This had less to do with magnanimity than the chief apothecary's part and more to do with the subtle demonstration of his authority. Those who publicly disagreed with him often end up exiled. Or worse. Some of the benches were occupied. Renegade apothecaries from a variety of legions and war bands sat or stood, waiting for them. There were 30 of them, not counting their accompanying slaves, bodyguards, and servitors. He saw some faces he recognized, fellow sons of the 3rd Legion. Others were new arrivals. The members of the consortium came and went as it pleased them, unless Bile wished otherwise. Whatever their origin, all bore some signs of their calling. Coats of flayed flesh worn overt mimicry of their leader, ornaments of bone, surgical dendrite harnesses, and signs of self-experimentation abounded. These alterations often went beyond the cosmetic and into the realms of wild fancy. Narthiniums whirred and clicked as internal sensors tested the air and took surreptitious bioreadings. Brutally modified servitors and mutant scribes stood behind their masters, patiently noting and muttering observations. The work could not be postponed, not even for a meeting such as this. Servo skulls hovered about the chamber, recording all that occurred for Bile's later examination. Those who failed to show the proper level of interest would be punished, or perhaps promoted, depending on his whims. The stink of the consortium hall was like a physical blow. It was washed over Oleander as he followed Bile down to the dais. The air was thick with a fug of chemicals, spoiled meat, and sour blood. It was not the smell of the slaughterhouse, but instead that of discovery, the reek of exploration. Here, as nowhere else, there were secrets of life and death studied and improved upon. Here, in these halls, new races of gods and monsters were being raised up and dashed down. He'd almost missed the smell of it. Igori and the other gland hounds took up positions near the doors, as was tradition. their weapons trained on the gathered apothecaries. It was more a symbolic gesture than an actual threat, but few questioned it. At least not more than once. No one would be allowed to leave until a decision was reached. Those who tried often found themselves occupying several of Bile's nutrient tanks simultaneously. Bile took his place on the dais and thumped the floor with his scepter once, twice, 3 times, until every eye was on him. "Brothers, attend me," he said. "We have a matter of some import to discuss. Step forward, Oleander Ko. Step forward and be recognized by the consortium." We'll pick up that chapter in the next video. It is really interesting when Bile says that we have to have order or we're just barbarians. That is what is so fascinating about reading and discovering other ways of being. We all have our way of relating to the world based on our nature and then the environment in which we were nurtured. It's not either or, it's both nature and nurture together. And it's easy to look at a creature like Bile, like the other apothecaries. I mean, you heard that. They are so tied to the work of mutilating other life that they can't even be bothered to physically attend when their boss is having a meeting. I mean, to the senses of a normal person, what they're doing is just absolutely horrific. But when you hear the history of who they were meant to be and what was stolen from them, perhaps that would drive any of us to be something other than what we were meant to be. Who knows? But that's the thing. When you're reading works like this, whether it's historical fiction, actual history, this is military science fiction, when you're reading, always remember to evaluate the work within the context in which it's written. This is a future where there is only war. It is everyone for themselves. And Bile is the prime example of what it means to only be out for oneself. He doesn't have servants because he wants friends. He doesn't let these people hang out on his craft world because he needs buddies. They're there because they're doing work that he might eventually find useful. And they all know that at a whim, if he's done with them, he will turn them into an experiment as well, or worse. That's just the reality of living in this version of the future. So Oleander is next going to bring his proposal to the consortium. Will they approve? Will they reject? His future hangs in the balance. By coming back after being cast out, after abandoning Bile, being his, for lack of a better term, closest, he took a risk in coming back because he could have been killed upon landing on the planet. He could have been blasted out of orbit. You know, he's lucky they let him land, but Bile is no fool. You don't live for 5,000-10,000 years by being a fool. He knows he wouldn't have come back unless there was something really valuable that he was going to present. He does have to, make Oleander sweat, though, because he abandoned everyone. So it's going to be interesting to see the story unfold. I've not made it all the way through the omnibus yet. It's a lot, but I am enjoying reading it. It is quite the story. And again, just like with all the books, I'm not going to read the whole thing because I don't want to get hand slapped. But I am determined to do something good with my YouTube channel, just finding that that beat of what works and what doesn't. But I do really enjoy the diving into Warhammer. I think I'm going to eventually do some paint with me videos as well, because I do love building armies, and I don't just paint the Warhammer stuff. You know, I get 3D prints of anime that I like, and I'll print them. Like, here's one that I've done. Actually, my husband did this guy for me. He 3D printed him, but his little tail broke off. But that's Pochita from Chainsaw Man. But he's going to print me a bigger one, and hopefully the tail will stay on this time. But, you know, painted this guy from a local shop that we like. They had some really cool prints. Just did this little bitty Serious Baby Yoda. And then also did this guy as well. I did him a long time ago. I'm pretty good at shading. I'm pretty good at hand painting. I'm learning to use an airbrush. I've never done that before. I've usually only ever hand painted. But we'll do some of these as well. This is a little guy I painted just at a paint and take night. I'm actually a decent painter. As you can see, I'm actually pretty good at it. But I'm also putting a little set of Necron flyers together for a game that we like. So I need 5 of these all together. I've got 2 more almost done. Need to get another one. So yeah, I'm just all wrapped up in all kinds of nerdity. But more videos will be coming. I'm trying to get consistent with uploading, figuring out a schedule now that I can get back to recording and whatnot. So I look forward to seeing you in the next one. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope I'll see you in the next video.